The Courage of the Truth, lectures by Michel Foucault, 1983-84, at the College of France. Lecture number 5, given on February 29th, 1984, the second hour of lecture 5. I am going to ask for your indulgence. What I am now going to offer you is no more than a stroll, an excursus, a wander. Imagine that we were able to work as a group, or that we wanted to write a book on cynicism as a moral category in Western culture. How would we go about it? If I had to project a study of this kind in advance, this is more or less what I would say. Next week, we will return to historical cynicism, that of antiquity. But now, having been rather stimulated by cynicism over these last few weeks, I felt like putting forward the following. There is no doubt that cynicism is apt to appear as a somewhat trivial and not just marginal figure in ancient philosophy. There are a number of reasons for this. In the first place, of course, there is the very strong discredit, which we will come back to, which weighed on cynicism in antiquity, or anyway, the standpoint which meant that established, institutional, and recognized philosophy always had an ambiguous attitude towards cynicism, trying to distinguish between a set of practices which were despised, condemned, and severely criticized, and then, on the other hand, something which was like the core of cynicism, and which was worth saving. This attitude towards cynicism was frequent in antiquity, and was no doubt a strong influence on its later discredit. The other reason is that some ancient philosophies have handed down to Western thought extremely strong and well-specified doctrinal cores, as in the cases of Plato and Aristotle, and to some extent Stoicism. Although this is already much less clear. This is clearly not the case with cynicism, for the good reason that we have a very few cynic texts, a fairly large number of which did exist, however, but also because the theoretical framework of cynicism, even in antiquity, seems to have been extremely rudimentary. Cynic doctrine has therefore disappeared, as it were. But doesn't this mean that cynicism, rather like Stoicism, Epicureanism, and especially skepticism, we will have to come back to this in more detail, was basically handed down, kept up, and carried on much more as an attitude, a way of being, than as a doctrine. We could, therefore, conceive of the history of cynicism not once again as a doctrine, but much more as an attitude and way of being, with, of course, its own justificatory and explanatory discourse. So it seems to me that we could study the history of cynicism through the centuries, from antiquity to our own time, from this point of view. I have to say that we are somewhat lacking in works which deal with this long history of cynicism. As far as I know, apart from some German texts, I can find hardly any reference to this problem of cynicism in its long history, and especially in any writings devoted to the relationship between, let's say, modern cynicism, cynicism in modern European thought and culture, and ancient cynicism. We would need more precise research. For the moment, I have found the following. In German, there is, first, a text by Tillich from 1935, which is called Der Mut zum Sein, the courage to be, or courage with regard to being, in which there is a clear reference both to Nietzsche, will to power, courage to be, and at the same time, of course, to existentialism. In this text, a distinction is made. I do not know if this is the first time this distinction appears. Anyway, it is explicit here between kynismus and zenismus. Tillich employs the term kynismus to designate ancient cynicism, which he describes as the cynic's criticism of contemporary culture from the standpoint of nature and reason. From this cynicism he derives, but with notable and considerable differences, contemporary Zionismus, contemporary cynicism, which, he says, is the courage to be one's own creator. In Parmenides, Parmenides and Jonah, Heinrich in 1966 also takes up this distinction between kynismus and Zionismus, and right at the beginning of his book, if I remember rightly, devotes a very interesting chapter to the long history of cynicism with, once again, the contrast between ancient kynismus and contemporary Zionismus. According to him, in response to the destruction of the city-state and of the political community of classical antiquity, ancient kynismus was a form of assertion of oneself which, no longer able to refer to or get support from the political and communitarian structures of ancient life, was indexed to, sought its point of reference and foundation in animality. According to Heinrich, the core of ancient kynismus would be an assertion of oneself as animal. like ancient Kainismus, the contemporary Zionismus of modern Europe, is also a form of self-assertion. And he notes the filiation, or at least continuity of, the experience of the cynical form. But this self-assertion does not take place by reference to animality, but is effectuated in the face of and in relation to absurdity and the universal absence of meaning. The third text to which we can refer is Gellen's book entitled Moral and Hypermoral. In the first chapter, he defines cynicism as a form of individualism, an assertion of the self, ich Betonung. Finally, the fourth book by someone called Sloterdijk, which someone pointed out to me recently, but which I have not read, appeared last year in Germany, published by Sir Kamp, and bears the solemn title Kritik der Zynischen Vernunft, Critique of Cynical Reason. No critique of reason will be spared us, not of pure or of dialectical or of political reason. And so now we have critique of cynical reason. It is a book in 2 volumes about which I know nothing. I have been given some, let's say, divergent views on the book's interest. In any case, in contemporary German philosophy, since the war, you can certainly find a whole problematization of cynicism in its ancient and modern forms. And it is undoubtedly something to be studied more closely. Why and in what terms has contemporary German philosophy posed this problem? If I restrict myself to the first 3 texts I have cited, since I do not know the 4th, it seems to me that these interpretations, which at least have the great interest of posing the problem of cynicism as a trans-historical category, nevertheless call for some comment. First of all, it seems to me that these authors systematically contrast a cynicism with a rather positive value. Ancient cynicism and a cynicism with a rather negative value. Modern cynicism. Of course, faced with this, it needs to be pointed out that there was always considerable ambiguity in the way in which ancient culture regarded and perceived cynicism. I reminded you of this a moment ago, and then, if we want to give cynicism its true dimensions as a form of existence in Christian Europe and modern Europe, we cannot just subject it to a uniformly negative judgment. I think that these first 3 analyses, I am not talking about the 4th, are constructed on the hypothesis of a fairly strong and pronounced discontinuity between ancient cynicism and modern cynicism, as if there were no intermediate forms, as if there were just these two, no doubt more or less related, but strongly contrasting forms. If there has been a long, continuous history of cynicism, implying, of course, diverse forms, different practices, and styles of existence modeled according to different schemas, it is easy to show the permanent existence across all European culture of something which may appear as cynicism itself. Le cynisme. Finally, and especially, in these interpretations, whether of Galen, Heinrich, or Tillich, cynicism is always presented as a sort of individualism, of self-assertion, an intensification of the specific existence of natural and animal existence, of existence at any rate in its extreme singularity, whether this is in opposition or reaction to the breakup of the social structures of antiquity, or faced with the absurdity of the modern world. By basing the analysis of cynicism on this theme of individualism, however, we are in danger of missing what, from my point of view, is one of its fundamental dimensions. That is to say, the problem which is at the core of cynicism, of establishing a relationship between forms of existence and manifestation of the truth. It seems to me that it is the form of existence as living scandal of the truth that is at the heart of cynicism, at least as much as the famous individualism we are in the habit of finding so frequently with regard to everything and anything. Well, if we were to agree, these are hypotheses for possible work, to consider the long history of cynicism on the basis of this theme of life as scandal of the truth, or of style of life as site of emergence of the truth, bios as alethurgy. It seems to me that there are some things we could bring out and tracks we could follow. In the long history of Europe, we could see at least three factors, three elements which were able to relay, again in diverse forms, the cynic schema, the cynic mode of existence, first in Christian antiquity, and then in the modern world. The first support for the transfer and penetration of the cynic mode of being in Christian Europe was, of course, formed by Christian culture itself. The practices and institutions of asceticism, In Christian asceticism, we find what I think was, for a long time, for centuries, the major medium of the cynic mode of being across Europe. There is a great deal of evidence for the fact that the ascetic practices of ancient Christianity were lived and brought into play as bearing witness to the truth itself. That the Christian ascetic wanted to give concrete shape to the truth by these same practices of ascesis in the manner of the cynic. Furthermore, we have 1,000 examples of the extreme closeness of the practice of cynic destitution as witness, martyr of the truth, and Christian ascesis as also bearing witness to the truth, although involving a different truth. One of the oldest is found precisely in Lucian with regard to Peregrinus. Peregrinus was a philosopher, a cynic, whose theatrical death Lucian recounts. He was burnt alive at the Olympic Games, I believe. Lucian writes an extremely violent text about this death in which he recounts Peregrinus' life, and at a certain point he was a Christian and on his own took up and practiced all the renunciations typical of the Christian life. Why? Out of faithfulness and obedience to the person Lucian calls the sophist crucified in Palestine. So Peregrinus is a cynic who passed through Christianity, or a Christian who was become a cynic. Anyway, the interaction between the two forms of life is close enough for someone like Lucian. Obviously, quite distant from these problems, quite hostile to all these forms of practice, to blend them together without too much difficulty. Similarly, in his criticism of the cynics, Julian later emphasizes the closeness of the cynic life and the Christian life. And it is notable that St. Augustine, for example, in a text I would like to quote, refers to this problem of the cynics. It is in a passage in the City of God, book 14, where he raises the question, can someone who leads the cynic mode of life really be admitted to the Christian community and be recognized as Christian? Which proves that the cynic mode of life was still practiced in Christian communities, or at any rate, that those who practiced the cynic mode of life wanted and sought integration in Christian communities. St. Augustine answers, it matters little to this city whether one adopts this or that kind of life in professing the faith which leads to God. So, when the philosophers become Christians, it does not require them to change their appearance and their ways of living, if these are not contrary to religion, but to give up their false doctrines. St. Augustine's lesson is clear, therefore. When the doctrine is good, one may perfectly accept into the Christian community someone who leads the Cynic life, adopts the Cynic way of dressing, and lives like a Cynic. We will find in St. Jerome, for example, against Jovinianus, Book 2, paragraph 4, chapter 14, something of the death of Diogenes, capped with a eulogy. He exhorts Christians not to be inferior to a philosopher like Diogenes. There is obviously nothing very surprising in the fact that at the beginning of Christianity, there was a noticeable interaction between Cynic practice and Christian asceticism. But what we should also note is that through the intermediary of Christian asceticism and monasticism, of course, the Cynic mode of life was passed on for a very long time. And even if explicit references to Cynicism and to Cynic doctrine and lives disappear, along with the term dog, referring to the cynicism of Diogenes, many of the themes, attitudes, and forms of behavior which are observable in the Cynics are found again in many spiritual movements of the Middle Ages. After all, the mendicant orders, those people who, stripping themselves of everything, adopting the simplest and coarsest clothing, go barefoot to call men to look to their salvation, and questioning them in diatribes whose violence is well known, take up in fact a mode of behavior which is the Cynic mode of behavior. The Franciscans, with their destitution, wandering, poverty, and begging, are, up to a point, the Cynics of medieval Christianity. As for the Dominicans, you know that they called themselves the Dominicanes, the Lord's dogs. Even if the link established with ancient cynicism was probably only a posteriori, it is in fact this model, passed on through Christianity, which was revived. We could find many other examples of this revival in the more or less heretical movements, which flourished and developed throughout the Middle Ages. The following is the description of Robert d'Arbrissel, that spiritual inspirer who was very important in the west of France, in Anjou and Touraine at the end of the 11th century. Dressed in rags, he went barefoot from village to village, fighting against the demoralization of the clergy and calling on all Christians to perform acts of penitence. Or again, you find this description in the Waldensian movement. They have no fixed abode. They travel in pairs like the apostles, tanquam apostolicum, naked, following the nakedness of Christ. Nudum Christum sequentis. And this theme, naked, following Christ's nakedness, following the nakedness of the cross, was extremely important in all this Christian spirituality. And here too, it refers, at least implicitly, to the famous cynic nudity, with its double value of being, at the same time a mode of life of complete destitution, and the manifestation in complete nakedness of the truth of the world and of life. The choice of life as scandal of the truth, the bareness of life as a way of constituting the body itself as the visible theater of the truth, seems to have been not only a theme throughout the long history of Christianity, but a particularly lively, intense, and strong practice in all the efforts at reform which were opposed to the church, its institutions, its increasing wealth, and its moral laxity. There is a Christian cynicism, an anti-institutional cynicism, a cynicism that I would say was anti-ecclesiastical, whose living forms and traces could still be seen on the eve of the Reformation, during the Reformation, even within the Protestant Reformation, or even the Catholic Counter-Reformation. All this long history of Christian cynicism could be followed up. Second, coming closer to our own time, it would also be interesting to analyze another support of the cynic mode of being, of cynicism understood as form of life in the scandal of the truth. This would no longer be found in religious practices and institutions, but in political practices. Here, of course, I am thinking of revolutionary movements, or at least of some of these movements, which you know, moreover, borrowed a lot from the different Orthodox and other forms of Christian spirituality. Cynicism, the idea of a mode of life as the eruptive, violent, scandalous manifestation of the truth, is and was part of revolutionary practice and of the forms taken by revolutionary movements throughout the 19th century. Revolution in the modern European world. This is a fact which is known, and I think we talked about it last year, was not just a political project. It was also a form of life, or more precisely, it functioned as a principle defining a certain mode of life. And if, for convenience sake, you want to call militantism the way in which life as revolutionary activity, or revolutionary activity as life, was defined, described, organized, and regulated. We can say that militantism as revolutionary life, as life devoted wholly or partially to the revolution, took three great forms in 19th and 20th century Europe. Two in particular are known, the oldest and the most recent, but I shall be interested in the third. Well, first we find the revolutionary life in the form of sociality in the secret. The revolutionary life in the secret society, associations, plots against present and visible society, formation of an invisible sociality ordered according to a millenarian principle and aim. This aspect of revolutionary life was obviously very important at the beginning of the 19th century. Second, at the other extreme, there is the militantism which no longer takes the form of secret sociality, but of visible, recognized, established organization, which seeks to assert its aims and dynamic in the social and political field. This militantism no longer hides itself in secret sociality, but appears and gains recognition in trade union organizations, in political parties, with a revolutionary function. And then, the third important way of being militant is militancy as bearing witness by one's life in the form of a style of existence. This style of existence, specific to revolutionary militantism, and ensuring that one's life bears witness, breaks, and has to break with the conventions, habits, and values of society. And it must manifest directly by its visible form, its constant practice, and its immediate existence. The concrete possibility and the evident value of an other life, which is the true life. Here again, right at the center of the experience of the life of revolutionary militantism, you find the theme, so fundamental and at the same time so enigmatic and interesting, of the true life, of that problem of the true life, which was always raised by Socrates, and which I do not think has ceased to run through all Western thought. Revolutionary life, life as a revolutionary activity, has had these three aspects: secret sociality, established organization, and then bearing witness by one's life, bearing witness to the true life by one's life itself. These three aspects of revolutionary militantism: sociality, organization, and style of existence were continuously present in the 19th century, but clearly they have not all or always had the same importance. Schematically, we could say that they have been dominant in turn. The aspect of secret sociality clearly dominated the revolutionary movements of the beginning of the 19th century. The organizational aspect became crucial in the last third of the 19th century with the institutionalization of the political parties and trade unions, in the aspect of bearing witness by one's life, of the scandal of the revolutionary life as the scandal of the truth was, roughly speaking, dominant much more in the movements of the mid-19th century. Dostoevsky should, of course, be studied. And with Dostoevsky, Russian nihilism, and after Russian nihilism, European and American anarchism, and also the problem of terrorism and the way in which anarchism and terrorism as practice of life taken to the point of dying for the truth. The bomb which kills the person who places it appear as a sort of dramatic or frenzied taking the courage for the truth, which the Greeks and Greek philosophy laid down as one of the fundamental principles of the life of the truth, to its extreme consequence. Going after the truth, manifesting the truth, making the truth burst out to the point of losing one's life or causing the blood of others to flow, is in fact something whose long affiliation is found again across European thought. But when I say that this aspect of bearing witness by one's life was dominant in the 19th century, that we find it especially in those movements which go from nihilism to anarchism or terrorism. I do not mean that this aspect has completely disappeared and was only an historical figure in the history of European revolutionism. In fact, this problem of life as scandal of the truth constantly resurfaces. You see the problem of the style of revolutionary life reappearing fairly constantly in what may be called leftism. The resurgence of leftism as a permanent tendency within European revolutionary thought and projects has always taken place not by basing itself on the organizational dimension, but on the dimension of militantism comprising secret sociality or style of life. And sometimes the paradox of a secret sociality which manifests itself and makes itself visible in scandalous forms of life. Moreover, it should not be thought that the dimension of the secret and style of life, or of life as scandal of the truth, completely disappears where revolutionism takes the form of organization in political parties. Here, Obviously, we would need a close analysis of the revolutionary parties in France, the socialist and communist parties. It would be interesting to see how the problem of the style of life was raised in the Communist Party, how it was posed in the 1920s, and how it was gradually transformed, elaborated, modified, and finally reversed, since we end with that paradoxical result, but which in a sense only confirms the importance of style of life and the manifestation of truth in the militant life. In the present situation, all forms and styles of life, which might have the value of a scandalous manifestation of an unacceptable truth, have been banished. But the theme of the style of life nevertheless remains absolutely important in the militantism of the French Communist Party, in the form of the, as it were, inverted injunction to adopt and assert persistently and visibly in one's style of life and all the accepted values, all the most customary forms of behavior, and all the most traditional schemas of conduct, so that the scandal of the revolutionary life as form of life, which, breaking with all accepted life, reveals the truth and bears witness to it, is now inverted in these institutional structures of the French Communist Party, with the implementation of accepted values, customary behavior, and traditional schemas of conduct, as opposed to bourgeois decadence or leftist madness. One can quite well imagine this analysis of the style of life in European revolutionary movements. And however important it would be to make this analysis, so far as I know, it has never been done. How the idea of a cynicism of the revolutionary life as scandal, of an unacceptable truth, clashed with the definition of a conformity of existence as the condition of militantism in the so-called revolutionary parties. This would be another object of study. After religious movements throughout the Middle Ages and over a long period, after political practice since the 19th century, I think there was a third great medium of cynicism in European culture, or of the theme of the mode of life as scandal of the truth. We would find it in art. And here again, it would be a lengthy and complex history. We would no doubt have to go back a long way, because however clearly asserted and violent cynicism's opposition to the different rules of conduct and cultural and social values was in antiquity, there was nonetheless a cynical art and literature in this period. Satire and comedy were often permeated by cynical themes. And even better, they were, up to a point, a privileged site for their expression. In medieval and Christian Europe, we would no doubt have to consider a whole aspect of literature as a sort of cynical art. The fabliau would no doubt belong to this domain, as well as the literature studied by Bakhtin, who relates it particularly to the festival and carnival, but which I think also certainly falls under this manifestation of the cynic life, the problem of the relations between the festival and the cynic life, naked, violent life, the life which scandalously manifests the truth. We would again come across many of the themes concerning the carnival and carnivalesque practice. But I think it is especially in modern art that the question of cynicism becomes particularly important. That modern art was and still is for us the vehicle of the cynic mode of being, of the principle of connecting style of life and manifestation of the truth, came about in two ways. First, with the appearance at the end of the 18th century, during the 19th, I don't know, again, this would all have to be studied, of something quite remarkable in European culture, the artistic life. Notwithstanding this, the idea that the artist alone, as artist, must have a singular life, which is not entirely reducible to the usual dimensions and norms, was already fully accepted. We only need to read Vasari's The Lives of the Artists, for example, or Benvenuto Cellini's autobiography, in which the idea that the artist, as artist, cannot have a life exactly like the lives of others is clearly and easily accepted. The artist's life and the lives of others are not commensurable. But at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, something new appears, which is different from what might be found in the Renaissance, in Vasari. This is the, I think, modern idea that the artist's life, in the very form it takes, should constitute some kind of testimony of what art is in its truth. The artist's life must not only be sufficiently singular for him to be able to create his work, but it must in some way be a manifestation of art itself in its truth. This theme of the artistic life, which is so important throughout the 19th century, basically rests on two principles. First, art is capable of giving a form to existence, which breaks with each and every other form, a form of which is that of the true life. The other principle is that if the artistic life does in fact have the form of the true life, then this in turn guarantees that every work which takes root in and starts from this life truly does belong to the dynasty and domain of art. So I think that this idea of the artistic life as the condition of the work of art, as authenticating the work of art, as work of art itself, is a way of taking up again, in a different light, from a different angle, and with a different form, of course, that cynic principle of life as manifestation of a scandalous break, by which the truth becomes clear, manifests itself, and becomes concrete. That is not all, and there is another reason why. Art has been the vehicle of cynicism in the modern world. This is the idea that art itself, whether it is literature, painting, or music, must establish a relation to reality, which is no longer one of ornamentation or imitation, but one of lying bare, exposure, stripping, excavation, and violent reduction of existence to its basics. This practice of art as laying existence bare and reducing it to its basics stands out in an increasingly noticeable way from the mid-19th century. Art, Baudelaire, Flaubert, Manet, is constituted as the site of the eruption of what is underneath, below, of what in a culture has no right, or at least no possibility of expression. To that extent, there is an anti-Platonism of modern art. If you have seen the Manet exhibition this winter, it stands out. There is an anti-Platonism of modern art, which was the great scandal of Manet, and which I think, without characterizing all art possible today, has been a profound tendency, which is found from Manet to Francis Bacon, from Baudelaire to Samuel Beckett or Burroughs. Anti-Platonism as art as site of the eruption of the basic, stripping existence bare. And art thereby establishes a polemical relationship of reduction, refusal, and aggression to culture, social norms, values, and aesthetic canons. This is what makes modern art since the 19th century the endless movement by which every rule laid down, deduced, induced, or inferred from preceding actions is rejected and refused by the following action. In every form of art, there is a sort of permanent cynicism towards all established art. We could call this the anti-Aristotelian character of modern art. Anti-Platonic and anti-Aristotelian modern art. Reduction, laying bare the basics of existence. Permanent refusal and rejection of every form of established art. In these two aspects, modern art has what could be called an essentially anti-cultural function. The consensus of culture has to be opposed by the courage of art in its barbaric truth. Modern art is cynicism in culture, the cynicism of culture turned against itself. And if this is not just in art, in the modern world, in our world, it is especially in art that the most intense forms of a truth-telling with the courage to take the risk of offending are concentrated. To that extent, I think we could undertake a history of the cynic mode, of cynic practice, of cynicism as mode of life linked to a manifestation of the truth. We could do this with regard to modern art as with regard to revolutionary movements, and as we have been able to do with regard to Christian spirituality. Forgive these superficial surveys. They are notes for possible work. Next week, we will return to some more serious themes about ancient cynicism. Thank you. Okay, that's the end of Lecture 5 of The Courage of the Truth.